The silence in my kitchen on March 15th was deafening. I sat at the antique oak table Bob and I had bought 43 years ago, staring at the calendar where I had circled today's date in red ink months earlier. 80 years old. 8 decades. Of life, love, loss, and legacy. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, its familiar melody echoing through rooms that suddenly felt too large and too empty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My phone hadn't rung once, not a single text message illuminated the screen. The mailbox contained nothing but bills and advertisements. Even the newspaper delivery boy, who usually waved and called out a cheerful good morning, had simply tossed the paper onto my porch without a glance toward the window where I stood waiting. I had been awake since 5, as was my habit, preparing myself for what I thought would be a day of celebration. I had styled my silver hair carefully, put on the blue dress Sarah had complimented last Christmas, and even applied a touch of the lipstick Bob used to say made my eyes sparkle. The coffee had grown cold in my cup as the hours passed, hope slowly dissolving like sugar in forgotten tea. This wasn't how Margaret Thompson had imagined her 80th birthday would begin. My name is Margaret, though everyone calls me Maggie. And until 3 years ago, I shared this house on Maple Street with my beloved husband, Robert. We built our life here in Riverside, Ohio, brick by brick, dream by dream. Bob passed away suddenly from a heart attack while tending to his prized tomato garden, leaving me to navigate the remainder of my journey alone. Or so I thought I would, be alone. My children, Sarah and David, had both promised they would never let that happen. They lived within 20 minutes of my house. Sarah in her sprawling colonial on the affluent side of town with her husband Mike and their 2 teenagers, and David in his modern suburban home with his wife Jennifer and their 2 children. 4 grandchildren who used to race through these halls every Sunday after church, filling the rooms with laughter and chaos that Bob and I treasured more than any possession. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my family had seemingly forgotten the most significant birthday of my life, they certainly hadn't forgotten about my money. Just last week, Sarah had called asking for help with Emma's private school tuition. The week before, David needed assistance with Connor's orthodontist bills. Mike required a loan for his struggling construction business, while Jennifer wanted funding for Madison's elite soccer league fees. Each request came with heartfelt explanations about temporary setbacks, unexpected expenses, and promises of repayment that never materialized. I had given freely, as I always had. After Bob died, I discovered we were far wealthier than I had ever imagined. The sale of Thompson hardware store 5 years earlier had netted us a substantial sum, invested wisely by Bob's financial advisor. Our life insurance policies, real estate investments, and decades of careful saving had accumulated into a fortune that surprised even me. Bob had always handled our finances, and while I knew we were comfortable, I hadn't realized we were what most people would consider rich. The knowledge came with both blessing and burden. I wanted to help my children and grandchildren, to ease their financial stress and provide opportunities Bob and I never had. When Sarah mentioned that Emma was struggling in public school and might benefit from the smaller classes at Riverside Academy, I wrote the check without hesitation. When David's promotion required the family to move to a better neighborhood for the children's sake, I helped with the down payment. These weren't loans in my mind. They were investments in my family's happiness and success. But somewhere along the way, my generosity had transformed from appreciated gifts into expected entitlements. The grateful phone calls became shorter and less frequent. The handwritten thank you notes my children used to send were replaced by quick texts, then eventually by silence unless another need arose. Family dinners became business meetings where my children would casually mention their latest financial challenges, always followed by meaningful glances and pregnant pauses. I thought about Dorothy, my closest friend since childhood, who had warned me about this very situation 6 months ago. We were having lunch at Sunset Manor when she noticed my checkbook on the table, open to a stub showing another substantial payment to Sarah. "Maggie, honey," Dorothy had said, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate slowness. "You know I love you like a sister, but this has gone too far. You're being taken advantage of." I had bristled at her words, defensive of my children, despite the growing unease in my stomach. They're my family, Dot. If I can't help them, who can I help? "There's helping, and then there's enabling," she replied gently. "Bob would be rolling over in his grave if he knew how they were treating you. Like a walking ATM instead of their mother." I had dismissed her concerns then, but sitting alone on my 80th birthday, her words echoed with uncomfortable truth. When was the last time Sarah had called just to chat about her day? When had David last visited without mentioning a bill he couldn't pay? When had any of my grandchildren sent me a drawing or called to tell me about school without their parents prompting them? The morning stretched into afternoon, and still my phone remained silent. I found myself checking and rechecking the device, wondering if perhaps I had accidentally turned off the sound or missed notifications. But the screen showed nothing but the time, 2:47 p.m. In years past, my birthday had been a celebration that started with sunrise calls and extended well into the evening with family dinners and cake. I walked through my house, pausing at the photographs that lined the mantelpiece and hallway walls. Here was Sarah's high school graduation, where she had tearfully thanked Bob and me for believing in her dreams of becoming a teacher. There was David's wedding day, when he had danced with me and whispered that he hoped to be half the parent I had been to him. Pictures of family vacations we had funded, graduation ceremonies we had attended, holidays where this house had been the center of joy and tradition. Each photograph told a story of investment, not just financial, but emotional. I had been there for every triumph and setback, every need and celebration. When Sarah struggled through her divorce from her first husband, I had provided both emotional support and the money for her legal fees. When David's business failed in its first year, I had quietly covered his mortgage payments for 6 months while he rebuilt. When the grandchildren needed anything, from school supplies to summer camp fees, Grandma Maggie was always the solution. But somehow, I had become invisible except when my wallet was needed. I was the family's financial safety net, the automatic yes to every request, the reliable source of emergency funds. Yet on the day that should have been about celebrating my life and the love we shared, I was forgotten entirely. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't being forgotten out of busy schedules or overwhelming responsibilities. I was being taken for granted because I had allowed it to happen. My unconditional giving had trained my family to see me as a resource rather than a person deserving of love and respect. I thought about Bob's philosophy about money and family. He had grown up poor, one of 7 children whose parents struggled to put food on the table. He understood the value of hard work and the importance of family support, but he also believed that love without boundaries often became destructive rather than helpful. Money should bring families together, not drive them apart, he used to say. But the moment you start throwing money at problems instead of offering real solutions, you stop helping and start hurting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Bob had always insisted that our financial gifts to the children come with conversations about responsibility, gratitude, and long-term planning. After he died, I had abandoned those principles in my grief and desire to maintain connection with my family. I had confused financial generosity with emotional closeness, assuming that my willingness to solve their problems would ensure their continued presence in my life. The afternoon shadows grew longer, and I realized I needed to face the truth about what my family relationships had become. This wasn't a simple oversight or miscommunication about dates. My birthday had been the same day for 80 years. Sarah and David had both called to wish me happy birthday every year since they learned to use the telephone. The fact that today had passed without acknowledgement meant something fundamental had shifted in how they viewed me and our relationship. I pulled out my laptop, a skill I had learned in my 70s, much to my children's surprise, and began reviewing my financial records. Over the past 2 years, since Bob's funeral expenses had been settled and I had begun helping my family more regularly, I had given away nearly $200,000. The amounts varied from Emma's $5,000 tuition payments to Mike's $30,000 business loan, but the pattern was consistent and staggering. More troubling was what I discovered when I looked more closely at how the money was being used. Sarah's social media posts showed expensive dinners and weekend getaways that seemed inconsistent with someone struggling to pay school tuition. David's wife Jennifer had recently purchased a luxury handbag that cost more than some people's monthly rent. Mike's construction business appeared to be thriving based on the new equipment and vehicles I could see in his driveway during my infrequent visits. The picture that emerged was not of families in genuine financial distress, but of families who had discovered that Grandma Maggie would fund a lifestyle they couldn't otherwise afford. My money wasn't solving emergencies. It was subsidizing choices and enabling spending habits that they should have been managing within their own means. As evening approached and my phone remained stubbornly silent, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Bob's death: clarity. The fog of grief and loneliness that had clouded my judgment for 3 years was finally lifting, revealing a situation I could no longer ignore or excuse. I wasn't angry yet. That would come later. At this moment, I felt the deep sadness of understanding that my family saw me as an ATM with a heartbeat, rather than as a mother and grandmother deserving of love and respect. My generosity had inadvertently taught them that my value lay in what I could provide, rather than who I was as a person. But Margaret Thompson hadn't built a successful life by accepting unacceptable situations. Bob and I had weathered the Great Recession, raised 2 children, built a business from nothing, and created a legacy of community involvement and financial success through determination and strategic thinking. The woman who sat in this kitchen on her forgotten 80th birthday was the same woman who had co-managed Thompson Hardware Store for 30 years, balanced budgets, negotiated with suppliers, and solved problems that seemed impossible at the time. I closed my laptop and walked to the window overlooking Bob's garden, now maintained by a landscaping service I paid for myself. The tulips he had planted were beginning to bloom, their bright colors a reminder that growth often comes after periods of dormancy and apparent death. Tomorrow, I decided, would be different. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my dignity and redefining my relationships with my family. I had the resources, the intelligence, and the motivation to ensure that this forgotten birthday would indeed be remembered forever, though perhaps not in the way my family might expect. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times again, marking the end of a day I would never forget, even if everyone else already had. As I prepared for bed, I felt something stirring within me that had been dormant since Bob's death. The fierce determination of a woman who had built something meaningful with her life and refused to let it be diminished by those who should have cherished it most. My 80th birthday had been forgotten, but Margaret Thompson was about to make sure she would never be overlooked again. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp March air that Bob used to say made everything possible. I woke before dawn, as had become my habit, but this time with a sense of purpose that had been absent for months. The previous day's hurt had crystallized overnight into something far more powerful: resolve. I made my coffee stronger than usual and sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, the same kind Bob used to use when planning major business decisions. At the top of the page, I wrote Operation Respect in my careful penmanship. It seemed fitting, since that's exactly what I intended to reclaim. The first item on my agenda was information gathering. I needed to understand exactly how my family viewed me and what they were saying about me when I wasn't around. More importantly, I needed to know the true state of their finances before I made any decisions about future support. I started by calling Patricia Rodriguez, the accountant who had helped Bob and me for years and now managed my investments. Pat had always been straightforward with us, never sugarcoating financial realities or enabling poor decisions. "Maggie," Pat's warm voice came through the phone. "How are you holding up? I heard through the grapevine that yesterday was your big day. How did the family celebration go?" The fact that my accountant remembered my birthday when my own children had forgotten it wasn't lost on me. "That's actually what I'm calling about, Pat. I need your help with something sensitive." I explained my growing concerns about my family's financial requests and asked if she could help me understand the true scope of what I had been giving away. Pat agreed to meet that afternoon, and I could hear the concern in her voice when she said she'd been wondering when I might want to review these expenditures. My next call was to Dorothy, who answered on the first ring as if she'd been expecting to hear from me. "Well," she said without preamble, "how was the birthday that wasn't?" I told her everything, from the silent phone to my growing realization about how my family viewed me. Dorothy listened without interruption, and I could practically hear her shaking her head through the phone. "Honey, I've been biting my tongue for months, but since you're finally ready to hear it, I've got some things to tell you. Things I've noticed when I've been out and about town." What Dorothy shared over the next 30 minutes left me speechless. She had seen Sarah and Mike at the country club several times, despite Sarah's claims that money was tight. Jennifer had been shopping at the most expensive boutiques in town, carrying purchases that cost more than many people's monthly salaries. David had been bragging at the hardware store about his new fishing boat, mentioning casually that his mother had helped make it possible. But the detail that cut deepest was Dorothy's observation about my grandchildren. She had overheard Emma telling her friends at the mall that her grandmother was totally loaded and would pay for basically anything if you asked right. The casual way my own granddaughter had spoken about me as if I were a convenient resource, rather than a person she loved, stung more than any forgotten birthday. "I wanted to tell you sooner," Dorothy said gently, "but I knew you weren't ready to hear it. Grief makes us vulnerable, and you've been so lonely since Bob passed. They've taken advantage of that, Maggie, and it's time you face the truth." After hanging up with Dorothy, I spent the morning walking through my house with new eyes. In the guest rooms that my family rarely visited anymore, I noticed how the furniture had accumulated dust. The children's artwork that once covered my refrigerator had been replaced by bills and medical appointment reminders. The family photos on my mantelpiece seemed to mock me now, frozen moments of connection that no longer reflected reality. I pulled out my cell phone and scrolled through my recent call log. The pattern was unmistakable. Incoming calls from Sarah and David clustered around times when they needed money, with weeks of silence in between. When had we stopped having conversations that weren't ultimately about financial assistance? The meeting with Pat that afternoon confirmed my worst fears and opened my eyes to possibilities I hadn't considered. We sat in her downtown office, surrounded by financial documents that told the story of my family's increasing dependence on my generosity. "Maggie, I have to be honest with you," Pat said, spreading bank statements across her desk. "This pattern of giving has me concerned, not just for your financial security, but for your family's long-term welfare. You're enabling a level of spending that they can't sustain without your support." She showed me detailed records of every check I had written, every transfer I had authorized. The numbers were staggering when viewed all together, but what struck me most was the escalation pattern. The requests had started small and reasonable: help with Christmas gifts, assistance with car repairs. But over time, they had grown larger and more frequent, as if my family had learned that I would say yes to almost anything. "Here's what really concerns me," Pat continued, pulling out a different set of documents. "I've done some research into your children's actual financial situations, and the picture doesn't match what they've been telling you. She had somehow obtained credit reports and public financial records that painted a very different story than the one my family had been sharing. Sarah and Mike's household income was substantial, certainly enough to cover Emma's tuition without assistance. David's promotion had come with a significant salary increase that he had never mentioned to me. Both couples had excellent credit, scores, and manageable debt loads, suggesting that their financial stress was more about lifestyle choices than genuine hardship. "They're not struggling, Maggie," Pat said bluntly. "They're overspending and using you as their safety net. But more than that, they're preventing themselves from learning financial responsibility because they know you'll bail them out." Pat then showed me something that made my blood run cold. A financial projection showing what would happen if my current giving pattern continued. Within 5 years, my liquid assets would be significantly depleted. While I would still be comfortable, I would lose the financial security that Bob had worked so hard to provide. "You need to understand something else," Pat said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "If something happened to you tomorrow, your current will leaves everything to your children equally. But based on their spending patterns, that inheritance would likely be gone within a decade. You're not just enabling them now, you're setting them up for financial disaster in the future." The conversation with Pat sparked an idea that had been forming in the back of my mind since yesterday's forgotten birthday. If my family saw me only as a source of money, perhaps it was time to show them exactly what life would look like without that source. But I needed to be strategic about it, to ensure that my actions would lead to genuine change rather than just temporary discomfort. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my children. Not to check on their needs or offer assistance, but to invite them to Sunday dinner at my house, just like we used to do when Bob was alive. Sarah answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear the television in the background. "Oh, hi, Mom. What's up?" The casual tone stung after 24 hours of silence about my birthday, but I kept my voice light. "I was hoping you and Mike and the kids could come for dinner this Sunday. I miss having everyone together." There was a pause, and I heard her talking to someone in the background before she came back to the phone. "Sunday's not great for us, Mom. Emma has soccer practice, and Mike's got plans with his buddies. Can we do it another time?" I pressed gently. "What about next Sunday? Or any Sunday that works for you?" Another pause. "Things are just really busy right now, Mom. The kids have so many activities and Mike's working extra hours to catch up on the business. Maybe we could grab lunch somewhere instead? Something quick?" The contrast between her inability to find time for family dinner and her immediate availability whenever she needed money wasn't lost on me. I kept my voice pleasant as I ended the call, but inside, another piece of my heart hardened. David's response was remarkably similar. Too busy with the kids' schedules, Jennifer had commitments, work was demanding. But when I casually mentioned that I had been thinking about setting up college funds for the grandchildren, his tone immediately became more engaged. "That's incredibly generous, Mom. Connor's been asking about college lately, and the costs these days are just astronomical. Should we set up a meeting to discuss the details?" I told him I was still in the planning stages and would be in touch, then hung up feeling simultaneously heartbroken and determined. My children had time to discuss my money but not to share a meal with me. They could prioritize meetings about college funds, but couldn't find 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon to maintain our family traditions. That night, I began researching something I had never considered before: hiring a private investigator. If my family was going to treat me like a business transaction, then I needed to approach this situation with the same level of due diligence I would apply to any major financial decision. I found a local firm that specialized in background checks and financial investigations. The next morning, I called and made an appointment with a woman named Linda Stevens, who had 20 years of experience in corporate fraud investigation. Linda's office was modest but professional, and her direct manner reminded me of Bob's no-nonsense approach to business. I explained my situation carefully, focusing on my concerns about the truth of my family's financial claims rather than my emotional hurt over their treatment of me. "Mrs. Thompson," Linda said, taking notes as I spoke, "what you're describing is actually more common than you might think. Adult children who view elderly parents as unlimited resources, especially after one spouse dies and the surviving parent becomes vulnerable to emotional manipulation." She explained that her firm could conduct a comprehensive investigation into my family's actual financial status, spending patterns, and even their conversations about me. The process would involve public records research, social media monitoring, and potentially some discreet observation. "I want to be very clear about something," Linda continued. "This type of investigation can reveal uncomfortable truths. Are you prepared to learn things about your family that might be difficult to accept?" I thought about Bob's advice about facing problems head-on rather than hoping they would resolve themselves. "I need to know the truth, all of it." Linda outlined a 3-week investigation plan that would give me a complete picture of my family's real situation. The cost was substantial, but nothing compared to what I had already given away based on misleading information. As I left Linda's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Bob's death: the thrill of taking control of a difficult situation. For 3 years, I had been reacting to events and requests, allowing others to set the terms of my relationships and my life. Now, for the first time, I was being proactive. Over the next few days, I began implementing other changes that felt both small and revolutionary. I stopped answering my phone immediately when my children called, instead letting calls go to voicemail so I could listen to the message before deciding whether to respond. The difference in their messages was telling. Those that began with, "Hi Mom, how are you?" were rare, while those that started with explanations of problems or needs were frequent. I also began paying attention to the patterns of their communication. Sarah typically called on Fridays, usually with weekend plans that required funding. David favored Monday mornings, when weekend expenses had depleted his ready cash. Both had learned to time their requests for maximum effectiveness, catching me when I was likely to be lonely or eager for contact. But perhaps the most revealing experiment was my decision to stop initiating contact entirely. For 1 full week, I didn't call or text either of my children unless they reached out to me first. The results were stark. 3 calls from Sarah, all related to money for Emma's school trip, and 2 from David, both about household repairs that had exceeded his budget. Not a single call asking how I was feeling, whether I needed anything, or simply to chat. Not one text message sharing a funny story about the grandchildren or asking for my advice on a decision. The silence spoke volumes about how our relationships had devolved into purely transactional interactions. Dorothy visited me that Friday evening, bringing Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine. As we sat in my living room, she listened to my updates about the investigation and my experiments in changing my communication patterns. "You know what I'm proudest of?" she said, raising her wine glass. "You're not doing this out of spite or revenge. You're doing it because you love them enough to force them to face reality." She was right. Despite my hurt and anger, my ultimate goal wasn't to punish my family, but to restore authentic relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The money had become a barrier to real connection, and removing it might be the only way to discover if love still existed underneath the financial dependency. "Bob would be so proud of you," Dorothy continued. "He always said you were the strongest person he knew, but I think grief made you forget that for a while. You're remembering who you are, Maggie, and it's beautiful to watch." As the week ended, I felt a growing sense of anticipation. Linda's investigation would soon provide me with concrete evidence about my family's real situation. More importantly, I was beginning to formulate a plan that would force my children to confront their treatment of me and make genuine choices about the kind of relationships they wanted to have going forward. The forgotten birthday had been a wake-up call, but it was becoming something much more significant. the catalyst for reclaiming my dignity and transforming my family dynamics. For the first time since Bob's death, I felt like Margaret Thompson again. Not just a checkbook with emotions, but a woman of substance who deserved to be treated with the respect and love she had always given others. The game was about to change, and this time I would be the one setting the rules. The envelope from Linda Stevens arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I had hired her firm to investigate my family's financial reality. I held it in my hands for several minutes before opening it, knowing that whatever was inside would fundamentally change how I viewed my children and grandchildren. The weight of the manila envelope felt heavier than paper, and photographs should have been. Inside were detailed reports, bank statements, credit card records, and photographs that painted a picture so different from what my family had been telling me that I had to read through everything twice to fully absorb the implications. Linda had been thorough in her investigation, and the evidence was both comprehensive and damning. Sarah and Mike's actual financial situation was far more comfortable than they had ever admitted. Their combined income exceeded $150,000 annually, and their expenses, while high, were manageable within their means. The tuition assistance I had been providing for Emma's private school was unnecessary. They could easily afford it themselves. More troubling were the credit card statements showing expensive dinners, weekend trips, and luxury purchases that occurred within days of receiving my financial help. The photographs were particularly revealing. There was Sarah at an upscale spa, charging treatments that cost more than many people's weekly groceries. Mike was pictured at a golf resort, playing on courses that required substantial membership fees. Emma and Tyler were wearing designer clothing and carrying electronics that certainly hadn't come from their allowances. David and Jennifer's situation was equally eye-opening. David's promotion had come with a salary increase that put their household income in the top 20% for our area. The home repairs and children's activities they claimed were stretching. Their budget were actually choices to maintain a lifestyle beyond what their income naturally supported, but well within reach if they prioritized differently. The most painful discovery was a series of text messages Linda had obtained through social media monitoring. Jennifer had written to a friend about how easy it was to get money from David's mother, describing me as super generous but kind of clueless about what things really cost. Sarah had posted on a private social media account about her mother being loaded and how she didn't mind helping out since she's got more money than she knows what to do with anyway. But the conversation that broke my heart was one Linda had recorded during surveillance at a restaurant where David and Jennifer were dining with friends. David had joked about his personal ATM and how his mother would probably pay for anything if you asked the right way. The casual cruelty of his words, spoken while enjoying a meal that likely cost more than I spent on groceries in a week, was devastating. Linda had also investigated my grandchildren's attitudes and discovered that they had been coached by their parents to ask me for money in specific ways. Emma had been instructed to emphasize her academic struggles when requesting tutoring funds. Tyler had been told to mention how left out he felt when asking for sports equipment. The manipulation was systematic and intentional, turning my grandchildren into unwitting accomplices in their parents' financial exploitation. The final section of Linda's report contained information I hadn't requested, but which she felt I needed to know. My family had been discussing my age and health with concerning frequency, speculating about my life expectancy and their eventual inheritance. Sarah had researched the average lifespan of women my age and had discussed with Mike how much money they might expect to receive when I passed away. These conversations revealed that my family wasn't just taking advantage of my current generosity. They were counting on my death to solve their long-term financial planning. I wasn't just an ATM to them. I was their retirement plan, their children's college fund, their ticket to a lifestyle they couldn't otherwise afford. After reading through Linda's report twice, I sat in my kitchen for an hour, processing the full scope of my family's betrayal. This wasn't simple greed or momentary lapses in judgment. This was calculated, systematic exploitation of my love and grief, carried out by people I had sacrificed for and trusted completely. But rather than feeling defeated, I found myself energized by clarity. For 3 years, I had been operating on incomplete information, making decisions based on lies and manipulation. Now I had the truth, and truth was power. The question was how to use that power most effectively. I called William Carter, the lawyer who had handled Bob's estate and had been our family attorney for decades. Bill had known Sarah and David since they were children, had watched them grow up, and had always spoken proudly of what fine adults they had become. I wondered how he would react to what I had discovered. Bill's office hadn't changed much over the years, still filled with law books and family photographs, including several pictures of him with Bob and me at various community events. He greeted me warmly, as always, but I could see concern in his eyes when I explained why I had come to see him. "Maggie, what you're describing is elder financial abuse," he said after reviewing Linda's report. "It may not be criminal in the traditional sense, but it's definitely a form of exploitation that we see more frequently as people live longer and accumulate more wealth." Bill explained that I had several legal options available to me. I could change my will to reduce or eliminate my children's inheritance. I could establish trusts with specific conditions that would force them to demonstrate financial responsibility before accessing funds. I could even pursue legal action to recover money that had been obtained through misrepresentation. But what interested me most was his suggestion about creating a family foundation. "You could establish a charitable foundation in yours and Bob's name, with your children serving as board members. They would receive reasonable compensation for their work, but the bulk of your wealth would go toward causes you care about. It would force them to engage with your values rather than just your money." The idea appealed to me on multiple levels. Bob and I had always been involved in community organizations, and the thought of our legacy being tied to meaningful charitable work rather than funding our children's unnecessary luxuries felt right. It would also provide a way to test whether my children were capable of thinking beyond their own immediate desires. Bill also suggested that I consider hiring a geriatric care manager, someone who could help me maintain my independence while providing an objective assessment of my needs and capabilities. Given what your family has been saying about your age and health, it would be wise to have professional documentation of your mental and physical competence. It protects you legally and makes it harder for anyone to claim you're not capable of making sound decisions. I left Bill's office with a comprehensive plan for protecting my assets and creating accountability for my family. But I knew that legal structures alone wouldn't address the deeper problem of restoring genuine relationships based on respect and affection. For that, I needed a more personal approach. My next stop was the Riverside Community Center, where I had volunteered before Bob's illness consumed my time and attention. The director, an energetic woman named Carol Martinez, remembered me fondly and was delighted when I expressed interest in becoming involved again. "We've missed you, Maggie," she said, showing me around the expanded facility. "Your fundraising skills were legendary, and we could really use someone with your business experience to help with our strategic planning." I explained that I was considering establishing a family foundation and wondered if the community center might be interested in partnering on some initiatives. Carol's enthusiasm was infectious as she described programs that needed funding: literacy, classes for adults, after-school tutoring for children, job training for people transitioning from welfare to work. "What would really make a difference," Carol said, "is having someone who could provide not just money but guidance and oversight. Too many donors write checks and disappear. We need partners who stay engaged and help us measure our impact." The conversation gave me an idea for how to involve my family in my philanthropic plans while testing their commitment to something beyond their own needs. I could require them to volunteer at organizations that would benefit from our foundation before they could participate in any distributions. Let them learn firsthand about people who had real financial struggles. unlike their manufactured crises. I spent the rest of that week visiting organizations throughout Riverside: the food bank, the homeless shelter, the domestic violence center, the library. At each stop, I learned about genuine needs and dedicated people working to address them. The contrast between these real problems and my family's lifestyle complaints became increasingly stark. At the food bank, I met families who were making agonizing choices between rent and groceries, between medical care and utilities. At the homeless shelter, I encountered people who had lost everything through job loss, medical bankruptcy, or domestic violence. These were the faces of actual financial hardship, not the manufactured stress of people who wanted luxuries they couldn't afford. The volunteer coordinator at the Domestic Violence Center, a social worker named Margaret Thompson with no relation to me despite sharing my last name, made an observation that particularly resonated. "We see a lot of financial abuse here," she said. "It's one of the most common ways that abusers maintain control over their victims. They create financial dependence, then use money as a weapon." Her words made me realize that I had become a victim of financial abuse within my own family. My children had created emotional dependence by exploiting my grief and loneliness, then used my money as a way to avoid taking responsibility for their own lives. The pattern was remarkably similar to what Rebecca described in domestic violence situations. "The key to breaking free," Rebecca continued, "is usually economic independence for the victim. When they regain control over their financial resources, they can start making choices based on what's healthy rather than what's necessary for survival." I was hardly surviving in the traditional sense, but I had been operating from a place of emotional desperation that made me vulnerable to manipulation. Reclaiming control over my money was indeed the first step toward reclaiming control over my relationships. That evening, I called Dorothy and asked her to join me for dinner at my house. I wanted to share my discoveries and plans with someone I trusted before taking any irreversible steps. Dorothy arrived with a bottle of wine and her characteristic directness. "Well, you look different," she said, studying my face as I opened the door. "More like yourself, if that makes sense. You've got that look Bob used to get when he was solving a particularly challenging business problem." Over dinner, I showed Dorothy the investigation report and explained my plans for establishing the family foundation and changing my relationship with my children. She listened intently, occasionally shaking her head at the more egregious examples of my family's manipulation. "I'm proud of you, Maggie," she said when I finished explaining my strategy. "But I have to ask, are you prepared for the possibility that this might end your relationships with your children permanently? When you cut off the money and demand real change, they might choose to walk away rather than face their behavior." The question had been haunting me since I first read Linda's report. Was I willing to risk losing my family entirely in order to demand that they treat me with dignity? The thought of holidays spent alone, of never seeing my grandchildren grow, of facing my remaining years without the people I loved most was terrifying. But then I thought about the conversation David had with his friends, joking about his personal ATM. I remembered Sarah's casual dismissal of my birthday and her inability to find time for family dinner. I considered Emma's description of me as totally loaded and willing to pay for basically anything. I said finally. "I've already lost my real relationships with them. What I have now are transactions disguised as family connections. If cutting off the money means they disappear from my life, then at least I'll know the truth about what I meant to them. And if it forces them to examine their behavior and rebuild genuine relationships with me, then I'll have my family back." Dorothy raised her wine glass. "To Margaret Thompson, who taught her family to take her for granted, and is about to teach them to respect her instead." The following Monday, I began implementing my plan in earnest. I met with Bill Carter to formalize the establishment of the Thompson Family Foundation, with myself as president and my children designated as potential board members, contingent upon their completion of volunteer requirements and financial responsibility training. I also began the process of restructuring my will to reflect my new priorities. Instead of leaving my entire estate to Sarah and David, the bulk of my wealth would go to the foundation, with provisions for my children to receive distributions, only if they demonstrated ongoing commitment to the foundation's mission and principles. The most satisfying part of the planning process was designing the volunteer requirements that my children would need to complete before accessing any foundation funds. Each would need to commit to 20 hours per month of hands-on volunteer work at approved organizations. They would need to complete financial literacy courses and demonstrate improved money management in their personal lives. Most importantly, they would need to present quarterly reports on their volunteer experiences and explain how their work had changed their understanding of genuine financial need. I also established new boundaries for my personal giving. Going forward, any requests for financial assistance would need to be submitted in writing, with detailed justification and documentation of actual need. I would take 48 hours to review each request and would require monthly progress reports on how the money was being used. But perhaps the most important change was my decision to stop being available for every call in crisis. I hired a housekeeping service, enrolled in art classes at the community center, and planned a trip to visit my sister in California. For the first time in 3 years, I was building a life that didn't revolve around my children's needs and demands. The foundation paperwork was completed on a Friday, exactly 1 month after my forgotten birthday. That evening, I sat in Bob's favorite chair and looked through our old photo albums, remembering the years when our family had been built on genuine love and mutual respect rather than financial dependence. I found a picture from David's college graduation, where he had thanked Bob and me not for our financial support, but for teaching him the values of hard work and integrity. There was a photo from Sarah's wedding to her first husband, where she had written on the back, "Thank you for showing me what real love looks like." Those people still existed somewhere inside my children, buried under years of easy money and enabled irresponsibility. My job now was to create circumstances that would force them to rediscover who they used to be and who they could become again. The stage was set for the most important family meeting of our lives. In a few days, I would gather Sarah and David together and present them with evidence of their betrayal and an opportunity for redemption. Their response would determine not just the future of our family, but the legacy that Bob and I would leave behind. For the first time since that silent birthday morning, I felt genuinely hopeful. I had reclaimed my power, gathered my resources, and prepared for battle. Now it was time to discover whether my children loved me enough to fight for our relationship, or whether they would reveal themselves to be exactly what Linda's investigation suggested they had become. I sent the text messages on Sunday evening, timing them carefully for maximum impact. To Sarah, "Please come to dinner Wednesday at 6 p.m. We need to discuss important family matters. Come alone." To David, "Family meeting. Wednesday 6 p.m. at my house. This is not optional. Do not bring Jennifer or the children." The responses came within minutes of each other. Sarah called immediately, her voice tight with concern. "Mom, what's this about? Is everything okay? Are you sick?" The irony wasn't lost on me that my first family gathering in months was prompting more worry than my 80th birthday had generated. "I'm fine, Sarah. We just need to have a conversation that's long overdue." "But why can't Mike come? And why does it sound so formal?" "Because this conversation is between me and my children. Wednesday at 6. Don't be late." David's approach was different, texting back, "Can we reschedule? Wed is tough with Connor's practice." When I replied that this was not negotiable, he called, adopting the tone he usually reserved for closing business deals. "Mom, you're being mysterious, and it's making me nervous. If this is about money, we can discuss whatever you need over the phone. You don't need to make it into some big production." His assumption that this was about my needs rather than theirs revealed everything I needed to know about how our family dynamics had shifted. "Wednesday, David, 6 o'clock. We'll talk then. I spent Monday and Tuesday preparing for the confrontation with the same methodical attention I had once brought to major business presentations. I organized Linda's investigation materials into clear, compelling evidence packets. I prepared copies of my bank statements showing the pattern of their requests and my responses. I even printed out screenshots of their social media posts and the transcripts of their recorded conversations. On Tuesday afternoon, I drove to the florist and bought fresh flowers for the dining room table, the same white lilies Bob and I had always chosen for special occasions. I wanted the setting to be beautiful but formal, a reminder of the family dinners we used to share when respect and love were the foundation of our gatherings. Dorothy stopped by Tuesday evening to check on my preparations and offer moral support. She found me in the kitchen, polishing Bob's good silver and setting out the china we had received as wedding gifts 57 years earlier. "You're treating this like a state dinner," she observed, running her finger along the edge of a crystal wine glass. "In a way, it is," I replied. "This is diplomacy at its most personal level. I'm about to negotiate the terms of my relationship with my children for whatever years I have left." Dorothy helped me arrange the flowers and review my presentation materials one final time. "Remember, Maggie, you're not trying to destroy them. You're trying to save them from themselves and save your family in the process." Her words steadied me as I faced the reality that by Wednesday evening, my relationships with Sarah and David might be fundamentally altered or potentially ended. But the alternative was continuing to enable their disrespect and financial irresponsibility, while my own dignity and their character continued to deteriorate. Wednesday arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of Ohio spring day that makes everything feel more serious and consequential. I dressed carefully in the navy blue suit I had worn to important business meetings, applied makeup with the precision of someone preparing for battle, and arranged my silver hair in the style Bob had always said made me look formidable. Sarah arrived first, precisely at 6, which surprised me since punctuality had never been her strength. She paused in the foyer, taking in the formal table setting visible through the dining room doorway, and I saw confusion cross her face. "Mom, this looks like Christmas dinner. What's going on?" "We're waiting for your brother. Would you like some wine?" She accepted a glass of the expensive Chardonnay I had opened for the occasion, and we made awkward small talk about the weather and Emma's upcoming spring break plans. Sarah seemed nervous, glancing frequently toward the driveway and checking her phone for messages from Mike. David arrived 10 minutes late, as was his habit, striding through the front door with the confident energy he brought to business meetings. He kissed my cheek and accepted wine, but I could see him cataloging details, the formal place settings, the expensive wine, the serious expression on my face. "Okay, Mom, we're both here. What's this about?" I gestured toward the dining room. "Let's sit down. We have a lot to discuss." Once we were seated around the table where we had shared thousands of family meals, I looked at my children and saw them clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Sarah, fidgeting with her jewelry and avoiding eye contact, looked younger then, her 52 years, but not in a good way. There was something childish about her posture, as if she were preparing to be scolded. David projected his usual businessman confidence, but I could see tension in his shoulders and the way he gripped his wine glass. "I want to start by asking you both a question," I began, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "When was my 80th birthday?" The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Sarah's face flush as the realization hit her, saw David's confident expression crumble into embarrassment and guilt. "Mom," Sarah whispered, "I am so sorry. I don't know how we forgot. We've been so busy with the kids and work and—" "March 15th, I interrupted. "It was March 15th, just like it has been every year for 8 decades. The same date you've called me on for your entire adult lives. The same date that's written in every calendar and phone contact you have." David leaned forward, his business training kicking in as he tried to manage the crisis. "You're absolutely right to be upset. There's no excuse for that kind of oversight. We should have remembered, and we should have celebrated properly. How can we make this right? The fact that his immediate response was to treat this as a problem, to be solved rather than a relationship to be repaired, told me everything I needed to know about how far we had drifted from genuine family connection. You can't make it right, David, but you can listen to what I have to say about why it happened and what we're going to do differently going forward. I reached for the first folder of evidence Linda had compiled and placed it on the table between us. I hired a private investigator to look into your financial situations. I needed to understand whether the money I've been giving you was addressing genuine needs or subsidizing lifestyle choices. The shock on their faces was immediate and profound. Sarah's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips, and David's mouth actually fell open. You investigated us? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. You hired someone to spy on your own children? I hired someone to verify claims that you've made to me about your financial situations. Claims that I've accepted without question and used as the basis for giving you nearly $200,000 over the past 2 years. I opened the folder and began laying out bank statements, credit reports, and photographs across the table. Sarah gasped when she saw the picture of herself at the spa, and David's face went pale when he recognized the surveillance photos from the restaurant where he had joked about his personal ATM. Your combined household income, Sarah, is more than sufficient to cover all of your expenses, including Emma's private school tuition. Your credit score is excellent, your debt-to-income ratio is well within normal ranges, and your spending patterns show regular purchases of luxury items and services. I turned to David. Your recent promotion came with a 30% salary increase that you never mentioned to me. You and Jennifer have been using my money to fund lifestyle upgrades while telling me you're struggling to make ends meet. The silence stretched for several minutes as my children absorbed the evidence of their deception. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice defensive and shaky. Mom, just because we have decent incomes doesn't mean we don't have legitimate expenses. Do you know what kids cost these days? The activities, the equipment, the college planning? We're not living extravagantly. I reached for the second folder and pulled out printouts of their social media posts and credit card statements. $500 for a single dinner at the country club, $800 for a handbag, a weekend trip to Chicago that cost more than some families spend on groceries in a month. This is not struggling, Sarah. This is overspending. David tried a different approach, leaning forward with the sincere expression he used with difficult clients. Mom, I think there's been a misunderstanding. When we ask for help, it's not because we're irresponsible. It's because we want to give our children opportunities and maintain family traditions. Sometimes that means we stretch our budgets thin. Stretching your budgets would mean cutting back on luxury spending to pay for your children's needs. Instead, you maintain your luxury spending and ask me to cover the children's expenses. You've turned me into a way to avoid making financial choices. I pulled out the transcripts of the conversations Linda had recorded and placed them in front of my children. But what hurts most isn't the money. It's discovering how you really see me. I read aloud David's comment about his personal ATM and Jennifer's text about me being easy to get money from. I shared Sarah's social media post about me being loaded and the casual way my grandchildren had been taught to think of me as a source of funding rather than a person deserving of respect. With each revelation, my children seemed to shrink further into their chairs. Sarah began crying quietly, while David stared at the table, his businessman facade completely abandoned. I want you to understand something, I continued, my voice growing stronger as I spoke. For 3 years, since your father died, I have been grieving not just his loss, but the loss of the close family relationships we used to have. I thought you were pulling away because you were busy with your own lives. I didn't realize you were treating me like a business relationship. I stood up and walked to the china cabinet, returning with a legal document that Bill Carter had prepared. This is the paperwork establishing the Thompson Family Foundation. As of yesterday, 60% of my assets have been transferred to this foundation, which will fund charitable work in our community after my death. The color drained from both of their faces as they realized the implications. David recovered first, his voice tight with panic. "Mom, you can't make major financial decisions like this without discussing them with us. This affects our children's futures, their college funds, their security. Your children's security should come from their parents' financial responsibility, not their grandmother's death. But there is a way for you to participate in the foundation and access its resources." I explained the volunteer requirements, the financial responsibility training, and the ongoing accountability measures that would govern any future family financial assistance. I outlined the new written request process and the documentation, requirements for any money they might need. "You're treating us like charity cases," Sarah said, her tears turning to anger. "We're your children, not strangers applying for grants." "You're right. You're my children, which means you should be held to higher standards than strangers, not lower ones. Strangers who ask me for money provide documentation of their needs and accountability for how they spend it. My own children have been asking for money based on lies and spending it on luxuries." David tried one more businesslike approach. "What if we pay back what we've borrowed? We could set up payment plans, maybe work out interest arrangements. Wouldn't that be better than this foundation idea?" "This isn't about the money, David. This is about respect and honesty and genuine family relationships. The money was a symptom of the problem, not the problem itself." I sat back down and looked at both of my children directly. "I love you both more than my own life. I have sacrificed and given and supported you in every way I could think of. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as a person deserving of love and respect and started seeing me as a resource to be managed." I pulled out my phone and showed them the call log that documented the pattern of their communication with me. "When was the last time either of you called me just to talk? When did you last visit without needing something? When did you last remember my birthday without being reminded?" The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. For 20 minutes, I laid out example after example of how our family relationships had become transactional, how their treatment of me had devolved into sophisticated manipulation designed to extract maximum financial benefit with minimum emotional investment. "I'm not cutting you off," I said finally. "I'm giving you the opportunity to earn back my trust and rebuild genuine relationships with me. But those relationships will be based on mutual respect and honest communication, not on your financial needs and my willingness to meet them without question." Sarah was crying openly now, but I could see anger alongside the grief in her expression. "So this is punishment for forgetting your birthday? You're going to hold our inheritance hostage because we've been busy with our own lives? This is consequences for treating me with disrespect and taking advantage of my grief and loneliness. The forgotten birthday was just the final proof that I had become invisible to you except when you needed money." David stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger that he was no longer trying to hide. "This is insane, Mom. You're destroying our family over money. You're punishing us for accepting help that you offered freely. I'm trying to save our family by forcing it to be based on something other than money. And I never offered help freely, David. You asked for help based on claims about your financial situations that were false. That's not accepting offered help. That's obtaining money through deception." The confrontation continued for another hour, with my children cycling through denial, anger, bargaining, and desperate attempts to regain control of the situation. But I held firm, backed by evidence they couldn't refute and legal structures they couldn't circumvent. Finally, as the evening wound down and the gravity of the situation fully settled over them, Sarah asked the question I had been expecting. "What happens if we can't do this? What if we can't meet your requirements, or we don't want to jump through these hoops?" I looked at both of my children, these adults I had raised and loved and sacrificed for. and gave them the most honest answer I could. Then you'll have made your choice about what kind of relationship you want with me, and I'll have my answer about whether you love me or just my money. The house felt eerily quiet after they left, Sarah in tears and David in barely controlled rage. I sat at the dining room table surrounded by the evidence of my children's betrayal and the legal documents that would govern our future relationships, and wondered if I had just saved my family or destroyed it forever. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt like Margaret Thompson again, a woman of dignity and strength who refused to be taken for granted by anyone, even the people she loved most in the world. The silence that followed my children's departure stretched through the night and into the following days. For 72 hours, my phone remained completely quiet. No calls, no texts, no desperate attempts to negotiate or manipulate the new reality I had presented to them. The absence of communication was almost more telling than their previous pattern of constant financial requests. I used those quiet days to reflect on what I had accomplished and what might come next. The dining room table, still set with Bob's good china from our confrontation, served as a daily reminder of the crossroads our family had reached. Each morning, I sat there with my coffee and considered whether I had been too harsh, too unforgiving, too absolute in my demands for change. But then I would remember David's casual cruelty in calling me his personal ATM, or Sarah's social media posts treating my generosity as an entitlement, and my resolve would strengthen. I had given them truth and choices. How they responded would reveal who they really were beneath the years of enabled selfishness. On Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after the confrontation, Dorothy called with news that both surprised and disappointed me. "Maggie, I ran into Jennifer at the grocery store yesterday. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days. When I asked how the family was doing, she started crying right there in the produce section." Dorothy paused, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully. "She said David was furious about what you'd done, that he was talking to lawyers about challenging your mental competency. She seemed genuinely shocked that you had investigated them, like it had never occurred to her that their behavior might have consequences." The news that David was considering legal action against me stung more than I had expected. After everything I had done for him, after raising him to value integrity and respect, his immediate response to being held accountable was to try to have me declared incompetent. It was perhaps the clearest indication yet of how far he had fallen from the values Bob and I had tried to instill. "There's more," Dorothy continued. "Jennifer mentioned that they had to cancel their vacation to Florida because they can't afford it without your help. Apparently, they had been planning to ask you for the money next week." She seemed genuinely confused about how they were supposed to pay for things now. The revelation that my family had been planning future financial requests even as they were taking my current generosity for granted was staggering. They hadn't just been spending my money. They had been building their entire lifestyle around the assumption that I would continue funding whatever they wanted. I thanked Dorothy for the information and hung up, feeling both vindicated and deeply sad. My children's immediate response to my boundaries had been anger and legal threats rather than self-reflection or attempts to rebuild our relationship. It told me everything I needed to know about their priorities and character. That afternoon, Bill Carter called to inform me that he had indeed been contacted by David's attorney. "They're fishing, Maggie. They want to know if there's any basis for a competency challenge. But I told them in no uncertain terms that you're sharper than most people half your age. I also made it clear that we have documentation of your mental and physical health from multiple physicians." Bill's voice took on a more serious tone. "I have to ask, though, are you prepared for this to get ugly? David seems determined to fight rather than accept the new reality. He might try to turn Sarah against you, or use the grandchildren as leverage." The thought of my grandchildren being used as pawns in this conflict was heartbreaking, but I had anticipated this possibility. "Bill, I've been thinking about this for weeks. If my children choose to cut me out of their lives rather than treat me with respect, then they were never going to be the kind of grandparents I want my grandchildren to have as role models anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, the silence from my children continued, but the community response to my situation was eye-opening. Word had somehow spread about my involvement with the community center and my plans for the Thompson Family Foundation. Carol Martinez called to tell me that several other families had expressed interest in volunteering, inspired by what they heard about my requirements for family involvement. "You've started something important, Maggie," Carol said during our meeting to plan foundation initiatives. "People are talking about the connection between privilege and responsibility, about what it means to give back to the community that supports you. Your story is resonating with families who want to raise children with better values." The irony wasn't lost on me that strangers were more excited about the values Bob and I had tried to instill than our own children were. But it also gave me hope that our legacy might ultimately reach beyond our immediate family to impact the broader community we had always cared about. Rebecca Thompson from the Domestic Violence Center also reached out, this time with a proposal that took my breath away. "Mrs. Thompson, I know you're dealing with family conflicts right now, but I wanted you to know that your foundation could make a tremendous difference for women trying to escape financial abuse. Would you consider funding an emergency assistance program for women who need help becoming economically independent?" The request felt like a sign from Bob, a way to transform my own experience with financial manipulation into help for women facing far more dangerous situations. I agreed immediately and asked Rebecca to develop a comprehensive proposal for the foundation's first major initiative. As March turned into April, I began receiving updates about my children's adjustments to their new financial reality. Frank Morrison, my elderly neighbor who had always been friendly with David, mentioned that he had seen David's boat for sale in the driveway. "Shame to give up that beautiful fishing boat," Frank said, not knowing the full story. "David told me they were downsizing some of their recreational equipment." Martha at the bank mentioned that Sarah had come in asking about refinancing options and debt consolidation services. "She seemed quite stressed," Martha observed. "I hope everything's okay with her family." These glimpses into how my children were responding to the removal of my financial support were instructive. Rather than examining their spending habits or considering the volunteer opportunities I had outlined, they seemed to be focused on finding alternative funding sources or cutting back on luxuries they had come to see as necessities. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday in mid-April, exactly 5 weeks after our confrontation. Emma, my 16-year-old granddaughter, called me directly, her voice small and uncertain. "Grandma Maggie? It's Emma. I know Mom and Dad said I shouldn't call you, but I miss you. And I wanted to say I'm sorry about your birthday. I had it written in my calendar, but I was so busy with school and soccer that I forgot to call." Hearing my granddaughter's voice after weeks of silence brought tears to my eyes. "Emma, sweetheart, thank you for calling. I've missed you too." "Grandma, I don't really understand what's happening with the family. Mom and Dad seem really upset, and they keep talking about money and lawyers and being treated unfairly. But Tyler and I were wondering if maybe we could still see you sometimes, even if the grown-ups are fighting." The conversation with Emma lasted an hour and gave me insights into how my children had been handling the situation with their own children. Rather than taking responsibility for their behavior or explaining the importance of treating family members with respect, they had positioned themselves as victims of my unreasonable demands. They had told the grandchildren that Grandma Maggie was going through a difficult time and had made some unfair decisions about money. But Emma was smart and perceptive, and she had noticed the inconsistencies in her parents' story. "Grandma, if you're having financial problems, why did Mom buy that expensive purse last week? And why is Dad still talking about getting a new truck?" I carefully explained to Emma that I wasn't having financial problems, but that I had realized our family relationships had become unhealthy in ways that needed to change. I told her about the volunteer opportunities and the foundation, framing them as chances for our family to work together on important community projects. That sounds really cool, Grandma. I've been wanting to do more volunteer work anyway for my college applications. Do you think I could help with some of the foundation stuff, even if my parents don't want to? Emma's enthusiasm and genuine interest in making a positive difference gave me the first real hope I had felt since the confrontation. Perhaps the next generation could still be reached, still be taught the values that Bob and I had tried to pass down. 2 days after Emma's call, Sarah finally contacted me. Her voice was strained and formal, unlike any conversation we had ever had before. "Mom, we need to talk. David and I have been discussing the situation, and we think there might be a way to work things out. Could we meet for lunch somewhere? Neutral territory?" I agreed to meet her at a small cafe downtown, curious about what approach she would take after weeks of silence. When I arrived, I found Sarah already seated at a corner table, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen her. The expensive clothes and perfect makeup were gone, replaced by a simple outfit and minimal cosmetics that actually made her look more like the daughter I remembered. "Mom, I want to start by apologizing," she said as soon as I sat down. "Not just for forgetting your birthday, but for the way I've been treating you. David thinks you're being manipulative and unfair, but I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past few weeks." She paused, seeming to gather courage before continuing. "I looked at our bank statements, really looked at them, and I realized how much money we've been spending on things we don't need. I saw the patterns you were talking about, how we'd get money from you and then immediately spend it on luxuries instead of the things we said we needed it for. This acknowledgement was more than I had dared to hope for, but I remained cautious. Sarah had always been skilled at telling people what they wanted to hear when she was in trouble. I also talked to Emma about her call with you. She was so excited about the foundation and the volunteer work. It made me realize that I haven't been modeling the kind of values for my children that you and Dad modeled for David and me." Sarah reached into her purse and pulled out a printed document. "I researched the domestic violence center you mentioned, and I filled out a volunteer application. I know I have to earn back your trust, but I want to try. Not for the money, but because I miss having a real relationship with my mother." I studied my daughter's face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculated strategy, but what I saw instead was genuine remorse and something that looked like the beginning of wisdom. "What about Mike? How does he feel about this?" Sarah's expression tightened slightly. "Mike is having a harder time with the changes. He keeps saying that families should support each other unconditionally, that requiring us to prove ourselves is insulting. We've been having a lot of arguments about it. And what do you think?" I think unconditional support without accountability isn't really support at all. It's enabling. I think I've been living like a teenager with a credit card instead of like an adult who should be managing her own responsibilities. We talked for 2 hours, and by the end of the conversation, I began to see glimpses of the daughter I had raised, the one who had once written thank you notes for every gift and who had wanted to teach elementary school because she believed in helping children grow into good people. Sarah agreed to begin volunteering at the Domestic Violence Center and to complete the financial responsibility training I had outlined. More importantly, she asked if we could start having regular family dinners again, with the understanding that money would not be discussed and that the focus would be on rebuilding genuine relationships. David's response was quite different. When Sarah told him about our lunch meeting and her decision to comply with my requirements, he exploded. According to Sarah, he accused her of betraying the family and enabling my tyrannical behavior. He refused to consider the volunteer work or training, insisting that the entire situation was beneath his dignity. "He's talking about cutting you off completely," Sarah told me during our second lunch meeting. "He says if you want to play games with your money, fine. But he won't participate in what he calls emotional blackmail." David's reaction disappointed me but didn't surprise me. He had always been more prideful than Sarah, more likely to double down on his position than admit he had been wrong. But his choice to prioritize his ego over his relationship with his mother told me everything I needed to know about his character development. The weeks that followed brought a gradual transformation in my relationship with Sarah, and through her, with Emma and Tyler. Sarah threw herself into her volunteer work at the Domestic Violence Center with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. She discovered skills she didn't know she had, and began talking about possibly returning to teaching after Tyler graduated high school. Emma started volunteering with me at the community center, helping with after-school tutoring, programs, and discovering a passion for working with children from low-income families. The contrast between these children's genuine struggles and her own previous complaints about financial stress was eye-opening for her. "Grandma, I had no idea how good we had it," she told me one afternoon as we organized supplies for a literacy program. "These kids are worried about having enough food at home, and I was complaining about not having the newest iPhone. I feel so ashamed of how I used to think about money." Tyler, initially resistant to the volunteer requirements, eventually joined us for community cleanup projects and found that he enjoyed the physical work and the sense of accomplishment that came from improving his neighborhood. Both grandchildren began asking thoughtful questions about poverty, inequality, and their own responsibilities as privileged young people. The most profound change was in my relationship with Sarah herself. Without the constant undercurrent of financial requests and assistance, we began talking about other things. Her dreams of returning to education, her concerns about raising confident but grounded children, her memories of Bob and their special relationship. "I think I forgot who I was for a while," she told me one evening as we prepared dinner together in my kitchen. "It was so easy to just ask you for money instead of figuring out how to solve problems myself. I stopped being resourceful and started being dependent." Mike struggled more with the changes, but gradually began to see the positive effects on his family. Sarah was happier and more engaged. The children were developing a stronger work ethic and social consciousness, and their household was actually more financially stable without the boom and bust cycle of my irregular assistance. David, however, remained estranged. He refused all attempts at reconciliation and eventually stopped allowing his children to visit me or participate in family gatherings that included Sarah and her family. His pride and anger had consumed his judgment, and he seemed determined to punish me for holding him accountable. The loss of my relationship with David and his children was the most painful aspect of my decision to demand respect and responsibility from my family. But over time, I came to understand that David's response revealed character flaws that had probably been developing for years, masked by my financial enabling and his professional success. Jennifer eventually reached out to me privately, expressing regret about the situation, but explaining that David had forbidden any contact between his family and me. She seemed genuinely sorry, but unwilling to challenge her husband's position, even when it meant depriving her children of their grandmother's love and guidance. As my 81st birthday approached, I found myself in a very different place than I had been a year earlier. The Thompson Family Foundation was now fully operational, funding literacy programs, domestic violence assistance, and job training initiatives throughout Riverside. Sarah had become an active board member, bringing genuine passion and fresh perspectives to our charitable work. Emma had received early admission to college based partly on her extensive volunteer work and her application essay about learning the difference between privilege and entitlement. Tyler was developing leadership skills through his community service and talking about studying social work in college. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my dignity and rebuilt genuine relationships with the family members who were willing to value respect over money. The forgotten birthday that had initially devastated me had become the catalyst for transformation that honored Bob's memory and restored the values we had tried to instill in our children. On the morning of my 81st birthday, my phone rang at exactly 7 a.m. It was Sarah, calling with birthday wishes and plans for a celebration dinner that evening. Emma and Tyler called throughout the day with homemade cards and promises of special surprises. Dorothy and several friends from the community center joined us for a birthday lunch that was filled with laughter and genuine affection. The house, that had felt so empty on my 80th birthday, was now filled with people who valued me as a person rather than as a source of financial support. The relationships I had rebuilt were stronger and more authentic than what I had lost, based on mutual respect and shared values rather than financial dependency. As I blew out the candles on my birthday cake that evening, surrounded by family and friends who truly cared about me, I made a wish that Bob would be proud of the woman I had become in the year since he'd been gone. I had learned that love without boundaries isn't really love at all, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to become better than they thought they could be. The Thompson Family Foundation continues to grow and impact lives throughout our community. Sarah has returned to teaching and brings her students to our volunteer events, showing them the importance of service and social responsibility. Maggie and Tyler are developing into thoughtful, compassionate young adults who understand the difference between having money and being wealthy in character. David remains estranged from our family, having chosen pride over love, entitlement over growth. I continue to hope that someday he will find the courage to admit his mistakes and rebuild our relationship. But I no longer sacrifice my peace of mind or enable his poor choices while waiting for that day. The forgotten birthday became the remembered lesson that transformed not just my family, but my entire understanding of what it means to love someone well. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst instincts, even when that refusal costs you the relationship you've always cherished. True love requires the courage to demand better, both from ourselves and from those we care about most. My family forgot my 80th birthday while spending my money, but I made sure they would remember forever the consequences of taking love for granted and the power of a woman who refuses to be invisible in her own life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.